The hangar smelled of motor oil and heated metal. The concrete walls kept the winter cold outside, but inside that immense space, the heat from the engines tested throughout the day still lingered in the air. Thomas looked at the technical drawings scattered across the stained wooden table, his tired eyes scanning every line, every curve, every handwritten note in the yellowed margins of the paper. At 32, he had devoted the last decade of his life to understanding how air moved around solid surfaces, how resistance could be overcome, how speed could be achieved without sacrificing control. He was an aeronautical engineer, and at that moment in history his work meant much more than numbers on a drawing board. The war had changed everything. What had once been pure theory, academic debates in quiet universities, now translated into life or death at thousands of feet in the air. Every design decision, every millimeter of adjustment to a wing, every degree of tilt to a tail, all of this determined whether a pilot would return home or become just another name on an endless list. Thomas felt the weight of this responsibility every morning when he entered that hangar, and every night when he left as shadows lengthened over the test track and silence took over the place. He did not work alone. At his side was a team of equally dedicated men and women, people who had left their former lives behind to join this collective effort. Mathematicians who calculated airflows with impressive precision, designers who transformed abstract concepts into detailed blueprints, mechanics who brought cold metal to life, turning sheets and rivets into machines capable of defying gravity. Each of them understood that time was a luxury they did not have. Reports coming in from the front brought urgent news about the performance of enemy aircraft, new tactics, and mounting losses that demanded quick and effective responses. If you want to hear more stories about overcoming adversity and innovation at decisive moments in history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the exciting content we share. Thomas's routine began before dawn. He walked through the still sleeping village, his heavy boots breaking the silence of the empty streets. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, tinging the low clouds with shades of pink and orange. Upon arriving at the hangar complex, he greeted the guard at the entrance with a discreet nod, showed his ID pass and headed toward his workstation. The smell of strong coffee wafted from the common room, where some colleagues were already gathering to plan the day, discuss the previous day's tests, and analyze data that had arrived during the night. The morning meetings were intense. The base commander, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a penetrating gaze, presided over the discussions with quiet authority. He listened to reports from each sector, asked specific questions, and demanded results without losing his composure. Thomas admired that leadership ability, that way of keeping everyone focused even in the face of constant pressure from above, impossible demands, and increasingly tight deadlines. The commander knew that everyone was doing their best, but he also knew that their best always had to be a little better. The central challenge occupying the minds of Thomas and his team was clear, but brutally difficult. How to create an aircraft that was fast enough to reach the enemy, agile enough to maneuver in combat, sturdy enough to withstand damage, and still bring the pilot back safely. Each of these requirements pulled the design in different directions. Speed required powerful engines and aerodynamic fuselages, but that increased weight. Agility demanded larger wings and responsive control surfaces, but that created more drag. Strength meant reinforced structure and additional armor, but again, more weight, less speed, less range. It was a complex puzzle where each piece affected all the others. Thomas spent hours in the wind tunnel, watching as colored smoke revealed the flow patterns around the scale models. He saw the vortices forming behind the wings, the turbulence creating at the junctions between the fuselage and tail, the points of flow separation that robbed efficiency and created unnecessary drag. Every observation was meticulously noted, every pattern photographed, every measurement recorded in tables that grew day by day. Rival engineers working in other nations faced exactly the same challenges. Thomas knew this. He had studied with some of them before the war, when borders were still just lines on maps and science was a universal language that united people from different backgrounds. Now those same colleagues were on the other side, applying the same principles, pursuing the same solutions, creating machines that would face each other in the skies in deadly duels. It was a bitter irony that Thomas preferred not to think about too much. The pressure on the team increased with each passing week. The pilots who tested the prototypes provided valuable feedback, but also harsh criticism. They talked about controls that were too heavy at high speeds, dangerous spinning tendencies under certain conditions, and limited visibility that put their lives at risk. Thomas listened to every word with rapt attention, noting every detail, because he knew these men were risking their lives to provide information that no theoretical calculation could offer. They were the bridge between theory and reality, between the drawing board and actual combat. At night, when most had already left, Thomas used to stay a little longer. He enjoyed that moment of silence when he could review the day's work without interruptions, when he could think clearly about the problems that remained unsolved. The yellow light from the lamp on his desk created a circle of brightness amid the darkness of the empty hangar. The distant sound of an engine being tested in another sector reached him muffled, a constant reminder that the work never completely stopped. He thought about his family, whom he had barely seen in recent months. He thought about his wife, who had learned to live with his absence, and his children, who were growing up without his constant presence. They understood, or at least tried to understand, why this work consumed so much of his time and energy. Thomas carried the guilt of this distance, but he also carried the certainty that he was contributing to something greater than himself. Every advance his team achieved, every improvement they implemented, every problem they solved, all of this translated into pilots returning to their families, missions successfully completed, hope for a different future. The following months brought significant advances but also revealed limitations that no one had fully anticipated. Thomas and his team were working on a specific project that sought to optimize the shape of the wings to reduce drag without compromising the lift necessary for quick maneuvers. The theoretical solution looked perfect on paper, with calculations indicating significant gains in speed and efficiency. However, when the first prototype with the new wings was tested in flight, unexpected problems arose that left everyone baffled. The test pilot, a veteran named Richard with over 200 hours of flight time in various models, reported intense vibrations above a certain speed. The wings literally shook, creating a frightening noise that he described as if the entire structure was about to disintegrate. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he listened to the report. Vibrations of that type could indicate structural resonance, a dangerous phenomenon where the natural frequencies of the structure resonate with aerodynamic forces, amplifying the movements until catastrophic failure occurs. The team spent days analyzing every aspect of the design. They reviewed the structural calculations, checked the properties of the materials used, and examined the joints and reinforcements. Thomas practically lived in the hangar, sleeping a few hours on a makeshift cot in the tool room. His eyes were red from exhaustion, his beard was unkempt, but he couldn't walk away while the problem remained unsolved. The pressure was coming from all sides. The commander needed answers. His superiors demanded results, and every day lost meant a delay in an already impossible schedule. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the youngest engineers on the team, Margaret, suggested modifying the stiffness distribution along the wingspan. She had noticed something in the vibration data that others had missed, a subtle pattern that indicated exactly where the oscillations originated. Thomas initially hesitated as the proposed modification would require redoing much of the wing's internal structure, but the more he analyzed the proposal, the more sense it made. Margaret was right. Her keen observation had identified the root of the problem. Implementing the change took 3 weeks of intense work. The mechanics completely dismantled the wings, exposing the intricate network of spars and ribs that formed the structural skeleton. New reinforcements were manufactured with millimeter precision, each piece tested individually before assembly. Thomas personally oversaw each step, checking measurements, checking alignments, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. The tension was palpable. If the modification didn't work, they would have wasted precious time and scarce resources that could not be squandered. The day of the test arrived with clear skies and calm winds. Ideal conditions. Richard climbed into the cockpit with a serious but confident expression. He knew the risks, he knew he was flying a machine still in development, but he also trusted the team's work. Thomas watched from the control tower as the aircraft taxied down the runway, the roar of the engine echoing across the field. The takeoff was smooth, the landing gear retracted without a hitch, and soon the silver silhouette was gaining altitude against the blue sky. The next few minutes were the longest of Thomas's life. He gripped the radio microphone so tightly that his fingers turned white. Richard performed the planned test sequence, gradually increasing speed, testing different configurations, pushing the aircraft to its established limits. His voice came over the radio, calm and professional, reporting every parameter, every sensation, every relevant detail. And then, finally, The words everyone was waiting to hear. The vibrations had disappeared. The aircraft flew steadily even at high speed, responding to the controls accurately and predictably. The relief in the hangar was almost tangible. People who had held their breath throughout the test finally relaxed. Some applauded, others simply smiled silently. Margaret received congratulations from the entire team, her face flushed with shyness and pride. Thomas shook her hand sincerely, publicly acknowledging her essential contribution. This was the kind of moment that made all the effort worthwhile, reminding everyone why they were there, why they continued to struggle with seemingly impossible problems. But the work was far from over. With the vibration issue resolved, new challenges arose. The maximum speed achieved in the tests was still below the desired level. Rival engineers had made significant advances in their own designs, and intelligence reports indicated that their latest aircraft outperformed existing ones in several critical areas. Thomas knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. The race for dominance of the skies was relentless, and whoever fell behind would pay a heavy price. The team focused its efforts on further reducing aerodynamic drag. Every bump on the fuselage was analyzed. Every joint between panels was refined. Every necessary opening was redesigned to minimize its interference with airflow. Thomas spent countless hours in the wind tunnel, testing subtly different configurations, seeking that perfect balance between all the conflicting factors. It was meticulous, almost obsessive work, but he knew that the details made all the difference. Pilots also contributed practical suggestions. They talked about the importance of visibility in combat, about how the position of the seat and the shape of the canopy affected their ability to detect threats. They talked about fatigue on long flights, about how poorly balanced controls required constant physical effort that drained their energy. Thomas listened carefully to everything, because he understood that an aircraft that was excellent on paper could be mediocre in the reality of combat if it did not take into account the real needs of those who flew it. The weekly meetings with the command became more tense. The war was evolving rapidly, and demands were constantly changing. What was a priority one month became secondary the next. New requirements arose based on recent combat experiences, changes in enemy tactics, and unexpected technological developments. Thomas and his team needed to be flexible, able to adapt their designs without losing sight of the fundamental objectives. There were moments of discouragement, inevitably, days when nothing seemed to work, when every solution created new problems, when accumulated fatigue weighed heavily on everyone. Thomas saw the signs of exhaustion in his colleagues: deep dark circles under their eyes, slower movements, growing irritability. He himself felt the weight of those months of uninterrupted work. But there was always something that pulled them back: a small victory, an unexpected breakthrough, a word of encouragement at the right moment. The arrival of winter brought new challenges. Testing aircraft in extreme cold revealed problems that did not appear at other times of the year. Systems that worked perfectly in the summer failed when temperatures dropped below zero. Fluids became too viscous. Metals contracted differently. Rubbers lost their elasticity. Each problem required a specific solution, and each solution had to be thoroughly tested before being implemented. Thomas developed a deep respect for the entire team. Each person there brought unique skills, specific knowledge, and different perspectives that enriched the collective work. He learned to listen more, to value contributions that might initially seem insignificant, to recognize that great advances often came from simple observations made by people attentive to detail. Spring arrived, bringing renewal, but also intensified testing. The aircraft had evolved significantly since the first prototypes, incorporating dozens of improvements that resulted from months of meticulous work. Thomas watched with restrained satisfaction as the reports from the test flights came in. The numbers were promising, indicating that they were finally achieving the delicate balance between speed, maneuverability, and reliability that they had been seeking from the beginning. However, a new challenge arose unexpectedly. During a high-altitude flight test, Richard reported strange behavior in the controls. The aircraft became progressively less responsive as it climbed, and above a certain altitude, the controls seemed to have almost no effect. He had to descend quickly to regain full control, and when he landed, he was visibly shaken. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Loss of control at altitude was one of the most dangerous situations a pilot could face. The team immediately gathered to investigate. Initial hypotheses pointed to problems with the mechanical control systems, perhaps cables stretched too tight by the cold at altitude, or joints freezing. But after thorough inspection, all components were in perfect condition. Thomas was puzzled. If it wasn't a mechanical problem, then what was causing this behavior? He spent the entire night reviewing technical literature, looking for similar cases, trying to find some clue. The answer came from a colleague who worked in high-speed aerodynamics. He mentioned recent research on air behavior in extreme altitude and speed conditions. The thin air at high altitudes had much lower density, which drastically affected the effectiveness of the control surfaces. The same surfaces that worked perfectly at low altitudes simply did not generate enough force when the surrounding air was so thin. It was a fundamental physics problem that no mechanical adjustment could solve. Thomas shared the discovery with the team during the morning meeting. The silence that followed was heavy. If the problem was physical and not mechanical, the solutions would be much more complex and time-consuming. Increasing the size of the control surfaces would help, but it would create more drag at low altitudes where it wasn't necessary. It was another difficult compromise, another choice between lesser evils. The commander listened to the explanation with a grave expression, then asked how long it would take to implement the modifications. Thomas didn't have a precise answer, but he knew it would be weeks, maybe months. If this story is touching your heart and you want to continue following journeys of overcoming adversity and dedication, click on "Thank you very much" so that more people can read these exciting stories. The decision was made to proceed with a gradual approach. They would test incremental modifications to the control surfaces, evaluating the impact of each change at both low and high altitudes. It would be a slow process, but it would minimize the risk of creating new problems while trying to solve the existing ones. Thomas coordinated the efforts, dividing the team into subgroups, each focused on specific aspects of the problem. Margaret took the lead of the group responsible for analyzing the aerodynamic behavior of the modified control surfaces. She demonstrated a remarkable talent for visualizing complex flows and predicting how subtle changes in geometry would affect overall performance. Thomas watched her work, impressed by her ability to stay focused even under constant pressure. She represented a new generation of engineers, bringing fresh perspectives and a willingness to question established assumptions. The tests continued over the following weeks. Each flight brought new data, each landing followed by hours of detailed analysis. Richard and the other test pilots developed specific routines to evaluate the aircraft's behavior under different conditions, gradually pushing the limits, exploring the frontiers of what was possible. Thomas admired the courage of these men, who repeatedly put their lives at risk to provide information that no simulation or calculation could offer. One afternoon, while reviewing data from a particularly revealing test, Thomas had a sudden insight. The numbers showed a pattern he hadn't noticed before, a correlation between the aircraft's speed and the effectiveness of the controls that suggested something beyond the simple issue of air density. There was some additional effect at play, something related to how air flowed around the fuselage at high speeds and how that affected the air reaching the control surfaces. He shared his observation with Margaret, who immediately understood the implications. If they were correct, the problem was even more complex than they had imagined, but there was also the potential for a more elegant solution. Working on modifying the airflow before it reached the control surfaces could amplify their effectiveness without necessarily increasing their size. It was a bold idea that would require extensive experimentation, but it was worth exploring. The weeks that followed were intense. The team manufactured small aerodynamic devices that directed the airflow more efficiently to the control surfaces. They were simple structures, almost unnoticeable when installed on the aircraft, but the initial results in the wind tunnel were promising. Thomas felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. So many times they had thought they were close to a solution only to discover new obstacles. The flight test with the modifications was scheduled for a clear spring morning. Thomas arrived at the hangar before dawn, unable to sleep due to anxiety. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the aircraft, examining every detail, personally checking each installation. Everything was impeccable, but he still felt that tightness in his chest that preceded decisive moments. Richard arrived shortly after, already wearing his flight suit, his face showing the serene concentration of someone about to face a significant challenge. The takeoff was smooth as always. Thomas watched from the ground as the aircraft gained altitude, its silhouette becoming smaller and smaller against the morning sky. The radio crackled with routine communications between Richard and the control tower. Altitude gradually increasing, speed increasing as planned, all systems functioning normally. Thomas held his notes so tightly that the paper began to crumple at the edges. and then Richard began testing the controls at high altitude. His voice came over the radio, each word clear and measured. Depth commands responding well, roll commands accurate, yaw commands adequate. The aircraft remained stable even during the most demanding maneuvers. Thomas felt his shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. It was working. The modifications were really working. When Richard landed and left the cockpit, his broad smile said it all. He walked straight up to Thomas and shook his hand firmly. That aircraft now flew as it should, responding to commands at any altitude, maintaining the agility necessary for combat, while reaching speeds that had previously seemed impossible. It was a significant victory, the result of months of collaborative work, of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, of refusing to accept limitations as definitive. The news spread quickly throughout the complex. The commander called a special meeting to publicly recognize the team's work. He spoke about dedication, technical excellence, and the impact that this breakthrough would have on future operations. Thomas listened humbly, knowing that the credit belonged to everyone there, each person who had contributed their expertise, effort, and creativity to overcome the challenges. Success brought recognition, but also increased responsibilities. The command decided to accelerate production of the improved aircraft, which meant that Thomas and his team would need to ensure that all modifications could be implemented consistently on an industrial scale. It was no longer enough to have a prototype that worked perfectly. It was necessary to develop manufacturing processes that would allow that quality to be replicated hundreds of times, in different facilities, with varying teams of assemblers. Thomas began dividing his time between the test hangar and the factories where the aircraft would be produced. They were completely different environments. While the hangar had an almost laboratory-like atmosphere, with small groups of specialists working on specific problems, the factories were vast operations where hundreds of workers performed tasks on assembly lines, following standardized procedures. The transition from experimental design to mass production revealed a number of challenges that Thomas had not fully anticipated. The factory workers, although skilled and dedicated, did not have the same level of technical knowledge as the development team. They followed instructions and performed repetitive operations, but did not always understand why every detail was important. Thomas had to develop extremely detailed procedure manuals with clear illustrations and accessible language, explaining not only how to perform each step, but why it needed to be done in exactly that way. It was tedious work, but absolutely essential. During his visits to the factories, Thomas often encountered minor deviations from established procedures. One worker thought he had found a faster way to assemble a certain component, another used a tool slightly different from the one specified, and a third adjusted tolerances based on his personal experience. Each of these deviations, individually, seemed insignificant, but Thomas knew that the sum of many small deviations could result in aircraft with inconsistent performance, or worse, potentially catastrophic structural failures. He had to learn to communicate differently. With his team of engineers, he could use technical jargon, refer to complex theoretical principles, and assume a certain level of shared knowledge. With factory workers, he needed to be more direct, use practical examples, and physically demonstrate what he expected. It was not a question of intelligence, but of different contexts and experiences. Thomas developed a deep respect for those workers who performed repetitive tasks with care and attention, even without fully understanding the science behind each procedure. Margaret often accompanied him on these factory visits. She had a special ability to identify where written procedures were ambiguous or unclear, where instructions needed more detail or better illustrations. Together, they reviewed and improved all production documentation, making it more accessible and more accurate. It was thankless work that took weeks, but Thomas saw the results when he returned to the factories and found assemblies being performed exactly as specified. This story shows how dedication and teamwork can overcome enormous obstacles. If you are enjoying it, click on "Thank you very much," so that these inspiring stories reach more people who need to hear them. Meanwhile, testing continued in the main hangar. New pilots were being trained to fly the improved aircraft, and each brought slightly different feedback. Thomas learned that individual pilots had distinct preferences and flying styles, and what one considered perfect another might find problematic. It was impossible to please everyone, but he tried to identify legitimate issues that affected safety or objective performance, separating them from personal preferences. A younger pilot named James reported difficulty performing a certain defensive maneuver that other pilots were able to perform without any problems. Thomas initially assumed it was a matter of technique or inexperience, but James insisted that there was something different about the aircraft he was flying. As a precaution, Thomas ordered a complete inspection of that specific aircraft. The maintenance team disassembled various systems, measured tolerances, and checked alignments. Everything was within specifications, but marginally different from other aircraft. That discovery was revealing. Even with rigorous procedures and careful quality control, there were still subtle variations between individual aircraft. It was impossible to completely eliminate these variations with the manufacturing methods available. Thomas had to accept that a certain degree of inconsistency was inevitable and focus on ensuring that all aircraft were within safe and functional limits, even if they were not absolutely identical. The summer months brought intense heat that affected both test operations and factory production. Thomas dealt with problems ranging from engine overheating during prolonged testing to workers exhausted by the heat on the assembly lines. Each situation required a specific solution. Each problem demanded attention. He felt constantly pulled in multiple directions, trying to keep everything running while deadlines continued to approach inexorably. There were moments of significant tension with the command. His superiors wanted higher production numbers, shorter deadlines, guarantees that Thomas could not honestly provide. He refused to compromise quality standards just to speed up deliveries, which led to conflict. The base commander usually supported him in these discussions, recognizing that defective aircraft were worse than production delays, but the pressure from above was constant and growing. Thomas began to feel the accumulated weight of so many months of intense work. His sleep was irregular, often interrupted by worries about pending problems or difficult decisions he needed to make. He lost weight, his uniforms became loose, and colleagues commented on his tired appearance. But there was no time for proper rest. Each day brought new challenges that demanded his attention, new decisions that only he could make based on his deep knowledge of the entire project. The team also showed signs of fatigue. Discussions that had previously been productive and collaborative sometimes became tense and defensive. People who were normally patient became easily irritated. Small mistakes that would previously have been corrected calmly now generated disproportionate reactions. Thomas recognized the symptoms of collective exhaustion, but he did not have the power to reduce the workload. The war would not wait, deadlines could not be extended, and the pressure would not ease. He tried to maintain team morale through small gestures. He publicly acknowledged individual contributions, celebrated small victories, and showed genuine appreciation for each person's efforts. These were simple things, but they made a difference. People needed to feel that their work was seen, that their sacrifices were recognized, that they were part of something bigger than isolated individual tasks. Richard, the chief test pilot, became not only a valuable collaborator, but also a close friend. They spent hours talking after flights, discussing not only technical aspects but also the emotional pressures they both faced. Richard understood the weight Thomas carried, and Thomas admired the courage Richard showed in flying prototypes still in development. There was a deep mutual trust between them, built through months of working side by side in situations where mistakes could have fatal consequences. The first production aircraft began to be delivered to operational units in late summer. Thomas personally oversaw the initial deliveries, wanting to ensure that everything was perfect. He talked to the pilots who would receive those aircraft, explained their capabilities and limitations, answered questions, and listened to their concerns. Seeing his creations leave the hangar and go into actual combat was both gratifying and terrifying. He felt personally responsible for the lives of every pilot who would climb into those cockpits. Autumn arrived, bringing news that deeply shook the entire team. One of the first aircraft delivered to operational units had been involved in a serious incident. The pilot had managed to eject and survived, but the aircraft was completely lost. Preliminary reports were vague, mentioning structural failure in mid-flight, but without specific details about what exactly had failed or why. Thomas felt his world collapse when he received the news. He immediately requested all available details, all recovered fragments, all witness statements. The investigation became his total obsession. He practically abandoned all other responsibilities to focus exclusively on finding out what had caused the failure. The possibility that a design error, something he had overlooked, could have caused it, tormented him constantly. He reviewed every calculation, every drawing, every decision made throughout the development of the project. Margaret and other team members tried to help, But Thomas was almost inaccessible, buried in piles of technical documents and investigation reports. He barely ate, slept even less, and his appearance deteriorated noticeably. The commander expressed concern, suggesting that Thomas delegate part of the investigation to others, but he flatly refused. It was his responsibility, his project, his aircraft. If there was a fault, he needed to find it and correct it before more lives were put at risk. The fragments recovered from the crashed aircraft were brought to the hangar for detailed analysis. Thomas examined them meticulously, looking for signs of structural fatigue, manufacturing defects, anything that might explain the failure. The wing structure showed complex fractures, but determining whether they were the cause or consequence of the accident was extremely difficult. Metallurgy experts were called in to analyze the fracture surfaces, looking for patterns that might reveal the sequence of events. Weeks passed without definitive conclusions. The pressure on Thomas increased exponentially. Management needed answers to decide whether the entire fleet should be grounded for inspections, which would be disastrous for operations. Pilots wanted to know if their aircraft were safe, if they could rely on them in combat. The production team was paralyzed, unsure whether to continue manufacturing more units or suspend everything until the cause of the failure was identified. Thomas faced the most difficult dilemma of his career. He was not entirely sure what had caused the accident, but he had to make decisions that would affect hundreds of people. Grounding the entire fleet as a precaution would be the safest choice, but it would deprive operational units of critical capacity just when they needed it most. Continuing to operate without modifications risked further accidents if the problem was systemic. There was no clearly correct choice, only alternatives with different types of risk. During a particularly difficult night, alone in the hangar lit only by the light on his desk, Thomas had a moment of deep doubt. He questioned whether he was really qualified for that responsibility, whether he had made fundamental mistakes that were now costing lives. The weight of guilt and uncertainty was almost unbearable. He held his head in his hands, feeling completely lost and inadequate for the task entrusted to him. It was Richard who found him in that state. The pilot entered the hangar late at night, looking specifically for Thomas, sensing that he needed support. They talked for hours, Richard sharing his own perspective on risk and responsibility. He explained that pilots consciously accepted risks, that they understood they were flying complex machines in extreme conditions, that accidents happened even with the best designs and the best intentions. It wasn't about eliminating all risk, but about doing the best possible with the knowledge and resources available. That conversation helped Thomas regain some perspective. He couldn't control everything. He couldn't guarantee absolute safety in a world where nothing was absolutely safe. But he could continue to work diligently, investigate honestly, and make decisions based on the best information available. That was all anyone could do, and he needed to accept that sometimes it wouldn't be enough, that sometimes bad things would happen despite all efforts. The discovery finally came from an unexpected source. One of the mechanics working on the factory assembly line contacted him to report that he had noticed a slight inconsistency in the heat treatment process for certain structural components. It was something subtle that he hadn't reported before because it appeared to be within the specified tolerances, but after hearing about the accident, he began to wonder if it might be relevant. Thomas immediately investigated that lead. Analysis revealed that there had indeed been a variation in the heat treatment process on some of the first aircraft produced. The variation was technically within the permitted limits, but it slightly reduced the fatigue strength of the affected components. Under normal operating conditions, this would not be a problem, but under the extreme stresses of aerial combat, especially repeated violent maneuvers, those slightly weakened components could fail prematurely. Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions as he processed that discovery. Relief at finally having a plausible explanation, guilt for not having specified tighter tolerances initially, gratification at discovering the problem before more accidents occurred. He called an urgent meeting with the command to present his findings and propose solutions. The solution involved two main components. First, all aircraft already produced would need to undergo detailed inspection of potentially affected components, with replacement when necessary. Second, manufacturing procedures would be modified to ensure more consistent and reliable heat treatment. It would not be quick or cheap, but it was necessary. The commander approved the plan immediately, recognizing that there was no acceptable alternative. Thomas personally coordinated the implementation of the inspections and modifications. He developed non-destructive inspection procedures that allowed structural integrity to be assessed without completely dismantling the aircraft. He trained teams of inspectors at multiple bases, ensuring that everyone understood exactly what to look for and how to evaluate the results. It was a massive operation involving hundreds of people working simultaneously in different locations. The following weeks were exhausting. Thomas traveled constantly between different bases, supervising inspections, solving problems that arose, and ensuring consistency in procedures. He saw aircraft being partially dismantled, components being replaced, and tests being performed to validate the repairs. It was gratifying to see the problem being systematically resolved, but also painful to recognize that this should not have been necessary if he had been more careful initially. Margaret took the lead in modifying manufacturing processes at the factories. She worked directly with production engineers and assembly line workers to implement stricter controls on heat treatment. They installed additional monitoring equipment, developed more detailed verification procedures, and trained operators on the critical importance of those processes. Thomas had complete confidence in her ability to execute that task with excellence. 3 months after the accident, all aircraft had been inspected and problematic components replaced where necessary. The new manufacturing procedures were fully implemented, and aircraft produced since then showed much greater consistency and structural properties. Thomas finally allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. The crisis had been managed, the problem solved, and there had been no further incidents related to that specific failure. The operational reports coming in from the combat units were encouraging. Pilots praised the performance of the improved aircraft, reporting superiority in several critical aspects compared to previous models. The speed allowed them to initiate and break engagements as needed. The maneuverability gave them an advantage in close encounters. The reliability meant they could trust their machines even on long and demanding missions. Thomas read those reports with deep satisfaction, knowing that his team's hard work was making a real difference. Richard continued to test additional refinements and improvements. Even with the aircraft already in full production, there was always room for incremental optimizations, small adjustments to control balance, subtle modifications to aerodynamic profiles, improvements to auxiliary systems. Each refinement was carefully tested before being incorporated into the production line. The development process never really ended. It was continuous evolution based on operational experience and technical advances. Thomas began delegating more responsibilities to senior members of his team. Margaret took the lead on several important sub-projects, demonstrating exceptional technical and management skills. Other engineers also grew in their roles, becoming experts in specific areas. Thomas recognized that he needed to rely more on his team, that he could not and should not try to personally control every aspect of the work. It was a difficult transformation for someone accustomed to direct involvement in every detail, but it was necessary. Spring brought news of the imminent end of the conflict. Military operations were nearing resolution, and although there was still active combat, everyone could sense that the end was near. For Thomas and his team, this meant a transition from urgent wartime development to calmer peacetime planning. It was a welcome change, but also surprisingly difficult to process emotionally. For years, they had lived under constant pressure, with a clear and urgent purpose driving each day. The prospect of returning to normalcy, of not having that constant intensity, was simultaneously appealing and disconcerting. Thomas realized that he no longer knew what his life would be like without that mission consuming all his energy and attention. He had changed fundamentally during those years, and going back to the way things were before was simply not possible. The commander organized a special ceremony to recognize the contributions of the development team. It was a simple but moving event, with each member receiving formal recognition for their work. Thomas was touched to see his team being honored. People who had sacrificed so much, worked tirelessly, and overcome immense challenges. He spoke briefly during the ceremony, struggling to control the emotion in his voice as he expressed gratitude and admiration for each person present. If you were moved by this journey of dedication and overcoming adversity, share this story so that it can inspire others. Leave a comment telling us if you have had experiences where teamwork and perseverance made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, the team gradually began to disperse. Some members were assigned to other projects, others returned to their previous civilian lives, and some decided to continue working in aeronautical development. Margaret received an offer to lead her own project at another facility, an opportunity she thoroughly deserved. Thomas encouraged her to accept, even though he knew he would miss her daily collaboration. Richard was also preparing for a transition. With the end of combat, the role of test pilot would become very different, less urgent, more focused on incremental development than on solving critical problems under extreme pressure. He talked about perhaps returning to teaching, sharing his experience with a new generation of pilots. Thomas admired that choice, recognizing that Richard had much to offer beyond his exceptional flying skills. For Thomas, the transition was also coming. He had received several offers, including a prestigious position at a university where he could teach and research without the operational pressures that had dominated the last few years. The idea was appealing. He missed his family, the time lost with his wife and children, the more balanced life he had left behind. But he also recognized that those intense years had made him a much better engineer, a more complete person, and a more effective leader. He spent his last days in the hangar organizing all the technical documentation developed throughout the project. It was an immense volume of information, detailed drawings, test reports, structural analyses, manufacturing procedures, lessons learned. Thomas wanted to ensure that all that knowledge was properly preserved, available to future generations of engineers who would inevitably face their own challenges. As he reviewed those documents, he could trace the complete evolution of the project. He saw the first rudimentary sketches when they were still exploring basic concepts. He saw the gradual refinements as understanding increased. He saw the creative solutions to specific problems. He saw the marks of collaboration, notes from different people contributing their unique perspectives. It was a fascinating story of human creativity, applied under extreme pressure. The last test flight Thomas witnessed was particularly emotional. Richard piloted one of the final aircraft, performing a sequence of maneuvers that demonstrated all the capabilities they had worked so hard to develop. The aircraft flew magnificently, responding precisely to every command, maintaining stability even in the most demanding maneuvers, and displaying impressive speed in low-level passes. Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and melancholy, knowing that this chapter of his life was coming to an end. After landing, he and Richard walked around the aircraft together one last time. They touched the smooth surface of the fuselage, felt the texture of the wrought metal, admired the elegant lines that were the result of so much effort to optimize. They didn't need to say much. They both understood what that machine represented, how much work had gone into each component, how many hours of dedication had been necessary to transform abstract concepts into tangible and functional reality. Thomas left the hangar for the last time on a quiet spring afternoon. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the test track. He paused at the entrance, turning to look one last time at the space that had been practically his home for years. Memories flooded his mind. The endless nights working alone, the heated discussions with the team, the moments of despair when problems seemed unsolvable, the bursts of joy when solutions were found, the deep friendships formed under pressure. All of that was part of him now, shaping who he had become. He thought of all the people who had contributed to this project. Some would continue in aviation, others would follow completely different paths, but they would all take with them the lessons learned, the skills developed, the confidence gained from overcoming monumental challenges. They had proven to themselves that seemingly impossible problems could be solved with persistence, creativity, and collaboration. This was a lesson that transcended aeronautical engineering, applicable to any challenge they might face in the future. Thomas finally turned and walked toward the gate. His steps were steady, his posture upright. He was leaving behind work he was deeply proud of, but he took with him experiences and knowledge that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, knowing that he had contributed something meaningful, that his work had made a real difference at a critical moment in history.